Margaret Calloway had worked the night shift at Harrowfield Regional Medical Center for 19 years. She was the kind of nurse who remembered which patients were afraid of the dark, and which ones slept better with the door open a crack. She never raised her voice. She never complained in the break room. She simply showed up, did her work with great care, and went home in the early morning light, while the rest of the city was still asleep. Her colleagues called her Maggie. Most of the doctors barely knew her name. That was perfectly fine with her. Maggie had learned long ago that quiet people see more than loud ones. She watched, she listened, and for the past several months, she had been noticing something that kept her awake even on her days off. The medication records were not adding up. It was not a dramatic discovery. There was no single moment of shock. It started as a small feeling, the way a person notices that a picture frame is slightly tilted on a wall. She would count the medication supply at the start of her shift, check the digital log at the end, and find that the numbers did not match. A few units here, a few there, small enough to be called a mistake. Small enough that no one else seemed to notice or care. But Maggie noticed, and Maggie cared. Over the next 6 weeks, she quietly documented every discrepancy she found. She wrote notes in a small spiral notebook that she kept in her scrubs pocket. She took careful photographs of the computer screen with her personal phone. She cross-referenced shift schedules with dispensing records, and what she found made her sit very still at her kitchen table one Tuesday night, staring at the papers spread out before her. Every single discrepancy traced back to the same authorization code, the code belonging to Dr. Harlan Voss. Dr. Harlan Voss was the chief medical officer of Harrowfield. He was tall, well-dressed, and spoke in the smooth, confident voice of a man who had never been questioned. He sat on the hospital board. He had photographs on his office wall taken with politicians and award committees. He was, by every visible measure, the most important person in the building. When he walked down a corridor, people moved. He called Maggie into his office one afternoon, just a few days after she had begun her documentation. He was friendly. He offered her coffee. He asked about her work and said she was a valued member of the team. Then, in the same pleasant tone, he mentioned that employees who raised unnecessary concerns about administrative matters often found hospital environments very stressful. He said it with a smile. He said it as if he were giving her helpful advice. Maggie thanked him for his time and went home. That evening, she scanned every document she had collected and stored copies in 3 separate places. 3 days later, she was called into the Human Resources office and informed that her position was being eliminated due to restructuring. There was no warning on her record. There had been no complaints about her work. Her access badge was deactivated at noon. She carried one small box to her car, placed it in the back seat, and sat in the parking garage for a few minutes without starting the engine. Then she wiped her face, took a breath, and called her nephew. Dane Calloway had been home from his 3rd overseas deployment for about 3 weeks. He was still adjusting to the quiet. He slept in short stretches. He ran before sunrise. He spent his afternoons with Atlas, his Belgian Malinois, walking through the neighborhood in a slow, unhurried way that was very different from how they had moved together in other places. Atlas was 7 years old, lean and alert, with tan and black fur and eyes that missed very little. He had served alongside Dane for 4 years, certified in tactical detection work. He could identify a wide range of controlled substances through walls, through sealed containers, through layers of other smells. His nose was, in the precise language of law enforcement, a legally recognized instrument. An alert from Atlas was enough to establish probable cause in a court of law. When Dane answered Maggie's call, he listened to everything she said, without interrupting her once. When she finished, there was a brief silence. Then he asked one question. "Do you still have everything you collected?" She said yes. "Then we are not done," he said. Dane drove to Maggie's house the next morning. They sat at her kitchen table for 4 hours. Dane went through her documents, the way he had been trained to go through field intelligence, carefully, in order, without assumption. He organized everything by date. He created a secure digital copy and stored it on an encrypted drive. He identified 3 places where the chain of evidence could be challenged and helped Maggie fill each gap with additional records she had forgotten she had. He did not tell her everything would be fine. He had been in enough difficult situations to know that honesty was more useful than comfort. But he did tell her that what she had collected was substantial. He told her it was the kind of record that was very hard to argue against. It was during that conversation that Maggie asked about Atlas, who was lying under the table with his head on Dane's boot. "He is still certified?" she asked. Dane nodded. He explained that Atlas had maintained his working certification during their transition to civilian life. He explained what that certification meant in practical terms. Controlled substance detection dogs did not require a search warrant to conduct a walkthrough in any area that was accessible to the public. A parking structure, a loading bay, a delivery area. If there was any trace of improperly stored medication anywhere on hospital grounds, Atlas would find it. Maggie looked at the dog under the table. Atlas opened one eye, looked back at her, and closed it again. "Then I think," she said quietly, "we should talk to someone." Detective Linda Okafor worked in the county's Financial Crimes and Healthcare Fraud Division. She was sharp, patient, and known among her colleagues for never dropping a case once she believed in it. She had believed in the Harrowfield case for 2 years. She had suspected that something was wrong inside that hospital's pharmacy operations, but she had never been able to find an entry point. Every time she got close, a door closed. Dane requested a meeting through a mutual contact in law enforcement. He arrived alone, with a printed report and a USB drive. He sat across from Detective Okafor in a small conference room and presented everything he and Maggie had compiled. He was not emotional about it. He walked her through the timeline, the discrepancies, the pattern of authorization codes, and the sequence of events that led to Maggie's termination. He let the documents speak. When he finished, Detective Okafor read through the printed report a second time without saying a word. Then she looked up. "I have been trying to get through that pharmacy wing for 2 years, she said. Dane told her about Atlas. Detective Okafor worked with a county prosecutor over the following week to confirm the legal conditions under which Atlas could be used. The hospital's public parking structure and its loading bay were both accessible without restriction. A K-9 walkthrough in those areas required no warrant. Dane volunteered his services as Atlas's handler. The operation was authorized. To avoid alerting anyone at the hospital, the walkthrough was scheduled as part of a Veterans Community Outreach program. A cooperative hospital administrator arranged for a brief visible presence of uniformed veterans near the building. It was a simple, believable cover. No one looked twice. On a Wednesday morning in late October, Dane and Atlas moved through Harrowfield's parking structure and then toward the loading bay at the rear of the building. Atlas walked at Dane's left side, calm and steady. His ears were forward. His nose was working. They moved past delivery vehicles, past storage crates, past a row of large metal lockers used by maintenance staff, each one padlocked. At the third locker from the left, Atlas stopped walking. He sat down, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the locker door. That was all he needed to do. That single, trained, unambiguous action was enough. Dane placed one hand gently on Atlas's side and looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Detective Okafor, who was standing 20 feet behind them, watching. She nodded once and reached for her phone. Within 48 hours, a search warrant was issued and executed. Investigators went through the loading bay locker, the pharmacy wing, and the private office of Dr. Harlan Voss. What they found confirmed everything Maggie had documented, and then went far beyond it. There was a second dispensing log, handwritten, kept separate from the official system. There was a phone containing encrypted messages. There were records that traced nearly $340,000 in controlled medications across 18 months. It was not careless or accidental. It was organized. It had been running for a long time. As the investigation widened, investigators interviewed nurse supervisor Brenda Tull, who had worked at Harrowfield for over a decade. She had known, in the way that people sometimes know things they cannot fully face, that something was wrong. She had stayed quiet because she did not believe anyone would listen. She had stayed quiet because she had seen what happened to people who spoke up. When she sat across from investigators and understood the full weight of what Maggie had done alone and what it had taken, she found she could not stay quiet anymore. She provided testimony that filled the remaining gaps in the timeline. She gave dates, names, and specific incidents that she had carried in silence for years. When the session ended, an investigator noted in the case file that Brenda Tull's decision to speak had been made easier by one thing. Watching what happened to Maggie Calloway had shown her that the truth could survive. Dr. Harlan Voss was taken into custody on a Friday afternoon. He was in the corridor between his office and the main ward, the same corridor he had walked for over a decade as the most powerful person in the building. 2 officers met him there. He was calm at first, as men like him often are, because they have never fully believed that consequences apply to them. Then the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, and the calm left his face. His colleagues watched from doorways. No one said anything. The corridor, which had always belonged to him, went very quiet. Dr. Voss was charged with 14 federal counts, including diversion of controlled substances, healthcare fraud, and obstruction of justice. 3 hospital administrators faced separate charges for falsifying audit records over multiple years. The cases were referred to federal court. The hospital's interim board chair contacted Maggie personally. She was offered her position back, with full back pay and a formal written apology entered into the permanent institutional record. She read the letter twice. She accepted the apology. She declined the job. She had already accepted a position at a small community health clinic on the other side of the city, where she ran the night shift. Before she accepted, she made one request of Harrowfield, that her personnel file be corrected, and that her termination letter be labeled, clearly and officially, as what it had actually been. They agreed. Dane was approached by 2 separate law enforcement agencies about joining a narcotics detection unit. He was considering both offers carefully, in the unhurried way he had learned to approach decisions since coming home. Atlas, for his part, received a formal commendation certificate from the county prosecutor's office. Dane had it framed. He hung it on the wall of their apartment next to Atlas's overseas deployment record. The case triggered a state audit of pharmaceutical practices across 11 regional hospitals. 2 additional cases were identified and referred for investigation. A medical licensing board convened a special panel on workplace retaliation, using Maggie's case as its opening example. Federal health regulators announced new anonymous reporting protocols within the following quarter. On the night that the indictment was formally announced, Maggie was working. A patient reached for her hand in the dim light of a small examination room and thanked her for being patient with him. She squeezed his hand and told him he was going to be fine. After her shift, she sat in the parking lot of the clinic for a few minutes. The city was quiet. She read the news on her phone. She set the phone down on the passenger seat and looked out through the windshield at nothing in particular. She thought about the patients on the 4th floor of Harrowfield who had received less pain relief than they needed, not because of any shortage, but because the medication that should have reached them had been redirected somewhere else. She thought about them the way she always thought about patients, with a specific and personal kind of concern that had never left her in 19 years. Then she started her car and drove home through the quiet, early morning streets. She had never set out to change anything. She had only set out to make sure the numbers were right, to make sure the patients got what they needed, to do the job she had always done, in the way she had always done it. She had not expected anyone to listen. She had not expected a detective, or a search warrant, or a dog who could smell the truth through a locked metal door. She had not expected her nephew to sit at her kitchen table for 4 hours and treat her notes as carefully as a mission briefing. She had not expected any of it. She had only expected to do what was right, even when it cost her everything she had spent 19 years building. What happened instead was something she still had difficulty putting into words when people asked her about it. A retired nurse she had once mentored sent her a short message the week the news broke. It said simply, "I always knew you were the bravest one in that building. You just never needed anyone to notice." Maggie read it 3 times, and then set her phone face down on the counter and made herself a cup of tea. Brave was not how she would have described herself. She would have described herself as someone who was very bad at looking the other way. She would have said that once she noticed something was wrong, she simply could not stop seeing it, and that once she understood what it meant, walking away would have felt like leaving a patient alone in the dark. That was something she had never been able to do. Not once. Not in 19 years. It turned out that, in the end, that was more than enough. End